2 weeks before the completion of V-6, on June the 14th of 1930, the U.S. began the next V-class submarine. Initially named V-7, she was renamed Dolphin in February of 1931 while still under construction. Finally completed June the 1st of 1932, she was significantly smaller than her predecessors, but larger than the S-class at 1,718 tons surfaced and 2,240 tons submerged. Though still initially designated a cruiser sub like the Narwhals, her weight, physical dimensions, weapons load, and range were reduced in light of not a few being unhappy with how large and thus slow to dive, hard to maneuver, and easy to detect the previous Vs were considered to be. A smaller sub was thought preferable by many, as the concept of a fleet submarine, which made it a more palatable weapon of war, was dying in favor of the historically effective lone hunter. Like the later World War I designed German submarines, she was partially double-hulled. So, the Narwhal design was scaled down with all its shortcomings and none of the range benefits inherent in its size. This would prove to be a costly mistake for Dolphin. The number of torpedoes carried dropped by a quarter. Range was cut in half. Test diving depth was reduced. Finally, the number and size of the gun armament was also reduced. What didn't change was the chronically plagued nature of its engines. As a result, like most older subs, Dolphin was obsolete by World War II. She served only briefly on the front lines before being relegated to training. Main armament was 4 forward and 2 aft 21-inch torpedo tubes for 18 torpedoes. That is to say, 2 reloads per tube. 1 4-inch 50 caliber deck gun was carried right in front of the sail. Propulsion was along the same lines as the previous class. 2 diesels provided 3,500 horsepower on the surface. Again, this could be boosted by 2 more diesels that generated 900 horsepower for recharging the batteries to reach a surface speed of 17 knots. While submerged, she used the batteries to power 2 electric motors that generated 1,750 horsepower for a speed of 8 knots. Diving depth was 250 feet. Dolphin was at Pearl Harbor when Japan attacked on December the 7th of 1941, but received no damage. In the first quarter of 1942, she patrolled the Marshall Islands, but returned in early March for resupply and repairs. Her next patrol began in mid-May, during which she patrolled near Midway during the battle there. She returned in late July, having scored no hits. Her final frontline patrol took her to the Kurils from October to December of 1942. Returning to Hawaii in January of 1943, she was relegated to training there until January of 1944, when she sailed to the East Coast and continued as a training sub until the end of the war. While the individual types of radar used on ships and subs during World War II often rightly gets the attention due them, sonar unfortunately doesn't. Almost frustratingly, some sources will name the various types of radar fitted, and even when, but will usually just say something to the effect of sonar was fitted, or just sonar. So let's take a look at U.S. sonar. The main passive sonar fitted to U.S. subs at the start of World War II was the JP series. This was a purely passive sonar. It was not mounted in the bow, towed behind, or stretched along the sides like modern sonars. It was a 3-foot-long horizontal tube mounted on a pole that was fixed to the main deck above the torpedo room, looking like a capital T. This tube could be hand-turned by a wheel underneath it. The tube itself contained 8, 4 on either side, nickel cylinders in a row, surrounded by a coil which developed a magnetic pulse when hit by sound waves traveling through the water. If it helps, think of them as being like tuning forks. Frequency range was from 70 to 12,000 Hz during the war. The back of the tube was covered with rubber to prevent sounds coming the opposite direction from interfering with sounds coming from the desired direction. The sounds then traveled down into a first amplifier and then into a second. From there it traveled into a filter, which is where it got interesting. In the filter were 5 selectable circuit pathways. The first was the bass boost circuit, which blocked mid and high frequency sounds above about 200 Hz, letting only low-frequency noises pass. The second was the flat circuit. This was generally the default setting used when searching. Its frequency range was the broadest at about 200 Hz and above. The third was the 500 circuit, which blocked noises below 500 Hz. The fourth was the 3000 circuit, which blocked noises below 3000 Hz. The fifth and final was the 6000 circuit, which blocked noises below, you guessed it, 6000 Hz. From the filter, the sound went through a third and then a fourth amplifier. After the fourth amplifier, the sonar operator could choose to route the sound into a diode called a turn count detector. This was a kind of filter which only let peaks in the sound pass. The idea was that these peaks would be the slapping of a propeller's blades as it turned in the water. With a bit of training and a lot of experience, a sonar operator could fairly accurately estimate a ship's speed and size based on the number of turns of its propeller. The sound then continued on through a few more amplifiers and filters to the sonar operator. He could route the sound through headphones to a speaker and up to the control room. While this sounds pretty crude, it was fairly effective for its time. A good sonar operator could locate a target's bearing with only a couple degrees variance pretty quickly and accurately. He could also pretty accurately judge a ship's size and speed. If there were multiple ships, he could generally also sort out the large ones, like battleships, from the small ones, like destroyers. Later, the JP series was replaced by the JT series. This was basically an improvement on the JP sonar with four main differences. First, the 3-foot-long receiver was replaced with a 5-foot one. This allowed the number of microphone elements to be increased from 8 to 20, with 10 on each side. This increased not only its sensitivity, but also its directivity. The second improvement was the addition of a motor to the hand wheel that allowed the sonar operator to turn the receiver himself, rather than having to give directions to someone else when the sonar operator was moved from the torpedo room to the control tower. The third improvement was the addition of an ultrasonic converter. This allowed the sonar operator to hear sounds usually above the human hearing spectrum by squashing them into the audible range. The fourth improvement was the RLI, or right-left indicator. To simplify its operation greatly, this was basically a signal strength meter. The two sides of the sonar were basically treated as two separate sonars. The RLI could determine which side was receiving the stronger signal, and the sonar could be turned to maximize reception and thus determine direction faster and more accurately. As good as these systems were for their time, they had two major drawbacks. While they could detect a target and give its direction, they couldn't provide its range or depth. To find range, a sub could come up to at least periscope depth and visually spot its target. To effectively determine range this way, the spotter had to know, or at least be able to closely estimate, the height of the target it was viewing due to the curve of the Earth. The danger here, of course, was that being on the surface, or at least putting up a periscope during the day, theoretically made the sub easy to detect, not only from spotting the surface part of the sub, but from the wake it left as it traveled through the water. The second way, and most commonly used during the war, was with radar. Day or night, in any weather, a sub's radar could accurately and instantaneously determine the target's range. The risk again was counter-detection. Some part of the sub still had to be surfaced, which potentially made it visible to the enemy. Also, many ships carried radar detectors that would tell its crew when it was being detected by radar. The third, and least used way, was active sonar. With active sonar, the sub sends out a ping, which bounces off the target and returns to the sub. The benefit here is the sub never has to surface to determine range. The downside, of course, is that the target can't help but know it's been detected because everyone on board will hear the sub's ping hit their ship. The target will then, of course, naturally start maneuvering to avoid any incoming torpedoes, while any anti-submarine escorts will steam back down the direction the ping came from. During World War II, it was usually suicidal for a sub to try to fight it out if detected. Stealth wasn't just their greatest asset, it was also usually their only defense. The main active sonar fitted to frontline U.S. subs was the WCA. Rather than being a single sonar, the designation actually refers to 3 separate sonars that were fitted together as a system. These were the NM series depth finder, the QB transmitter, and the combined QC and JK transmitter and receiver. Unlike the purely passive JP and JT sonars, which are fitted to the deck and thus useless while surfaced, the WCA system was usually fitted to the keel of the sub and could be used while surfaced. To be fair though, the noise made by the sub as it sailed along the surface at high speeds usually pretty severely degraded its performance. Early versions were blinded by flow noise at about 5 knots, submerged or surfaced. The addition of rubber covers increased this to 10 knots. During the war, the use of thin metal covers increased their maximum speed to about 15 knots. Let's take a look briefly at each of the 3 parts that made up the WCA system. One part was the NM depth finder sonar. This was a transmitter panel that was flush to the sub's hull. It wasn't movable and didn't need to be, since its only purpose was to shoot a short-range, high-frequency sonar wave straight down for the purpose of determining depth. Next we'll move on to the QB series transmitter. This was a ball that usually lowered from the bottom of the sub under the forward torpedo room on the starboard side. It was an active transmitter. One side of the ball housed the active transducer, covered by a rubber dome. The other side was a dummy iron dome that was there to direct the waves in the desired direction. Obviously, this meant the sonar could only transmit in one direction at a time, so to avoid having a blind spot, the ball could be rotated. While not often used, the QB sonar was kept because it had a wider frequency range. Finally, we get to the paired JK and QC sonar, sometimes called QCD. Again, this was a ball that usually lowered from the bottom of the sub under the forward torpedo room, except on the port side. One side housed the QC active pinger, while the other side housed the JK passive sonar. Like the QB sonar, QC could only transmit in one direction at a time, like a searchlight, so the ball could be swiveled. The JK side could be, and usually was, used as a passive sonar, but obviously was useless when the QC side was pinging. Effective passive sonar range for US subs was usually up to 3 miles, with active sonar in the range of 1.5 miles. Given these rather limited ranges and passive sonar's inability to give a target's range, while the newest torpedo, the Mark 14, could go to either 2.25 miles or 4.5 miles, it shouldn't be surprising most attacks were made using radar or periscopes. As a disclaimer, I want to restate that this was the usual sonar fit on most frontline subs, namely the post-V classes. It wasn't the only layout, and as sonar quickly progressed, different types and layouts could be found, especially near the end of the war. But in general, you get the idea. Of course, any comments, thoughts, or rants are welcome below.